Hello, and welcome to Nashville Retrospect Conversations. I'm your host, Allen Forkum. I'm also the editor of the Nashville Retrospect. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably have some interest in history, hopefully local history. And if so, I urge you to go to NashvilleRetrospect.com and learn more about Nashville's past. We have a newspaper that we published for 11 and a half years. We've got a podcast that is available for free. We also have the Nashville History Map, which is a guided tour of downtown from a historical perspective. And we have the Dispatch, which is a free email newsletter. If you go to NashvilleRetrospect.com, you can sign up for free. Now, when I started this video series, I had in mind to jump from topic to topic and place to place, all about the city, covering stories I had missed in the Retrospect newspaper. But with this third episode, I have ended up with a trilogy of hills. Now, in the first episode, we featured the Civil War and the Fort Negley, which is on St. Cloud Hill. You can see it in the upper right-hand side of that picture. In the second episode about the waterworks and sewer systems, we went to different parts of the city, but that included Kirkpatrick's Hill, on which the 8th Avenue Reservoir stands today. With this, the third episode, we have ended up back in the same area just south of Nashville to discuss Curry's Hill, which has many other names that we'll talk about, but is today the location of E.S. Rose Park and the surrounding neighborhood known as Edgehill. Now, Edgehill is a historically African-American community, and it has a fascinating past about which I knew nothing until I started researching the Retrospect newspaper. And what has struck me most about this history is the extreme impact exerted on the community by the government, both positive and negative, from the liberation of enslaved people during the Civil War to the forced reshaping of the neighborhood during urban renewal. Now, tonight we have two guests to help us tell the story of Edgehill. Ronnie Miller was born in the neighborhood nearly 70 years ago and still lives there today. He'll be joining us later in the program to talk about his experiences there. But first, we're going to look at the early history of Edgehill. And to help us do that, we have another Edgehill resident who is also a history professor and associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Tennessee State University, Dr. Joel Dark. Joel, thanks for joining the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Now, we should probably be upfront with everybody and let them know that you and I are good friends, and we have been, you mostly, but have been researching this history for a number of years now.
Yes, and I would, though, like to say that a lot of what I know about Edgehill really does come from some of your work as well, which I think will be evident as we talk.
Well, and it's also
you've given a lot to me to think about and to learn about when it comes to the neighborhood. So I appreciate that too.
Well, again, I sometimes find things and send it to you. You've put it all together. And I think what's neat about what we're going to do tonight is kind of look at the state of where we are now, which continues to develop. Even as we were putting this together, we're learning new things about the neighborhood. So I look forward to doing this even more into the future. So let's start. You're a resident there. How long have you lived in Edgehill?
I moved to Edgehill in 2002, and I live on 15th Avenue, which is kind of in the western part of the neighborhood.
Okay, so for those who don't know where Edgehill is, how would you describe the boundaries of the neighborhood?
I think Edgehill today actually has official boundaries. On the east side, it would be Interstate 65. On the north side, it would be Interstate 40, which separates Edgehill from the Gulch. On the south, it would be Wedgwood, which kind of separates us from Belmont and the 12th South area. And then on the west side, it would be Music Row. It would be 16th Avenue. The area was defined in its largest extent by the Edgehill Urban Renewal project of the 1960s, which went on into the 12th South area, into the Gulch area, over into Fort Negley. But the modern boundaries of the neighborhood are a little bit smaller than that.
And so before we get into the earlier history, what can you tell us about the name Edgehill? I mean, we know there's a hill there, but does that have anything to do with the name? Or?
The hills, no, the hills don't have anything to do with Edgehill. Edgehill was the name of I'm trying to remember the person's name. I think A.R. Thompson, who was a Nashville merchant who built a house in the late 1800s, roughly where the Peabody Library is today. And that house still exists. It was moved over to Bowling Avenue. And that house gave its name to the street Edgehill. And then in the course of the 20th century, the area, a good bit to the east of that, initially there was an Edgehill Park, later the Edgehill Homes, later the Edgehill Urban Renewal area. So the area was, I guess, the house that originally gave its name to Edgehill would today not really officially be in Edgehill. That would be more in the Vanderbilt Music Row area.
Okay. Well, you mentioned some of the earlier, like that earlier house. Let's go back even farther in time and to as far as we know, what we've been able to find the beginning. And this probably applies to a lot of if not all the land in the area, is that it started with land grants. And just very briefly, for those who don't know, land grants were given to veterans of the Revolutionary War as compensation for their service. And they had the option of selling those grants to other people. Sometimes those people would buy multiple grants. In this case, as you see in this picture, we have one that Elijah Robertson purchased, which was one of two, which was 2 of 4 that make up today's Edgehill. And this is an abstract looking map, but if you look in the upper middle, you see the word ash. That's indicating a tree that was setting on top of in the middle of what is today's Rose Park. So Joel, do you know much about that time period? Do we know much about that earliest period or not?
Well, that's a great example of a place where you have done the research. So I don't know really anything about the very beginning of the neighborhood in terms of the land grant, but you did, indicate that land grant was to Elijah Robertson. And the earliest record that I had of anything happening in what's now Edgehill was the birth of Sackville Macklin on Meridian Hill, Curry's Hill, Rose Park, whatever you want to call it, but in 1809. And I, because of your research, I was able to put him together with Elijah Robertson of the land grant, and he was that was basically Elijah Robertson's nephew, and that's significant because it shows that it wasn't just a land grant, but that members of the family were living there and that someone was actually born there.
Right. Now, we had that wonderful image there. If we could go back to that, we have the name Meridian Hill. This is from an 1833 map, which is just a wonderful map because there are pictures all around it. It not only has this view, but it has the view from the house you see in the center. So we've got the name Meridian Hill. What else do we know about the people who lived there at the time this drawing was made?
Well, so focusing on the drawing, and again, that's a really good introduction to this. This is from an 1833 map. Edgehill, from 2 different perspectives. One of them is this one. Is featured in 2, I think, maybe of 16 drawings that are kind of around the edge of the map. And there are 5 houses pictured there, and most of them have estate names. So you have and I think it's hard to see probably on the screen, but they're numbered. So number 1 is Rock Castle, which is the estate of Dr. James Overton. And then I guess the most important is, number 2 at the top of the hill. That was called Meridian Hill. The estate that was the residence of Robert Brownlee Curry, who had been the postmaster and mayor of Nashville. Then you have Park Cottage, which is Moses Stevenson's academy or school for boys. Then you have Elmwood, which is a school for girls. That's Daniel Berry's estate. And then you have Henry Bates Inn, which we know from a later record was later on the corner of 12th Avenue and Division Street. And I think it's significant that these are estates, and that they have, as I said, they have names, and these are very prominent Nashville families. Also significant is to note that all of these 5 individuals had enslaved Nashvillians associated with them in as early as the 1840 census, maybe even earlier. And the total number, I believe, just for those 5 names, not even counting family members, is 108 in the 1840 census. And then I see you have on the screen the 1850 census and also the 1860 census. And so, in addition to focusing on these 5 names, there are also 108 people that we know less about, but who obviously contributed to clearing the land and creating the scene that you see in the image. They also presumably worked on building the turnpikes that would define the neighborhood, the Franklin Turnpike, and then later the Middle Franklin Turnpike that becomes 12th Avenue and Granny White.
And so, and how many people is there a total, do we know the total number of people enslaved there? Is it just a rough estimate, or?
Well, from the 1840 record, again, just for those 5 names of Curry, Overton, Berry, Bateman, and Stevenson, there are 108 people listed.
Wow.
And I think there are a couple of burial records in the Nashville City Cemetery. I also found, not with one of those names, but someone else who was living in the neighborhood, an ad for someone who had escaped from slavery, who was linked to this area of Nashville.
So we happen to know that that image of the hill was 1833. We happen to know that in 1834, the Tennessee passes a new constitution that embeds in it a protection for the institution of slavery in Nashville. And we're going to jump ahead a little bit now. That institution is challenged by the Civil War that breaks out, and that has a big impact on the community there. We know the Union Army comes here. If people remember from our discussion about Fort Negley, once they're here, they start looking at Nashville as from the perspective of fortifying it. And so here you can see the 3 hills we've been discussing. In the upper right is Fort Negley. In the lower right is Blockhouse Casino. And then to the left of that is going to be another fortification. Joe, what can you tell us about what the Union built there and how it was built?
Well, these are the 3 main forts south of the city, and then there's also Fort Houston, which is at the roundabout plaza where the Music Roundabout is. And these forts were built by the U.S. Army using conscripted labor from people who had escaped slavery or who were impressed. And we know that hundreds died in the construction of these fortifications. But we also know that this is the moment in 1862 and 1863 where Nashville goes from being a site of enslavement to being a site of freedom, or at least potential freedom. And thousands of people come to Nashville for that reason, not just from the immediate area, but from throughout Tennessee. I was fortunate a few years ago to find a letter from an Edgehill resident from around 1930, reflecting on his escaped from enslavement with his family in the area near Swanee. And he recounted in detail, I think it was October of 1862, how he leaves that area, goes to Deckard Station, arrives on Pine Street in what's now the Gulch in 1862, and then lives out, the rest of his life in freedom in Nashville.
And so we know from the Fort Negley discussion that we had that these forts attract contraband, African Americans who have escaped slavery. In this picture, we see the fortification in the background that was built on Meridian Hill and Curry's Hill that we've been talking about. What can you tell us about what happened around the hill during this time?
Do you mean during the war?
During the war, yeah, as the war is progressing. And
well, I think one way to think about this is that you have downtown Nashville, and then you have the threat to Nashville from the Confederacy, and which is to the south, and this area between Nashville and these forts. These become contraband areas, and the term contraband was a term used at the time to refer to people who had been enslaved and were now within the jurisdiction of the United States Army. And this is a very large area, and there are accounts of contraband camps along the Franklin Turnpike, around closer over to Fort Negley, and then there are contraband areas, more to the west and the north, over in Edgehill, closer to downtown. And I think this is in some ways, an area between the city and the outer fortifications that provides some safety.
And from the accounts that I've seen, is pretty destitute. A lot of the people were obviously coming here. There's no houses. There may be tents or shacks that they're living in. But we know that I don't know how much the Union Army could really do to help. I know they supplied some tents in one case, at least, where they had an official contraband camp somewhere in Nashville, possibly in this area. But what do we know about people who came here to help, and who were they, and what did they accomplish?
Well, you have almost immediately, and maybe even immediately after the U.S. occupation of Nashville, groups from the north coming in and as relief societies. Some of these being the denominations that had split before the Civil War into North and South, and so groups from various denominations coming. For Edgehill, the really important group that I have found, and I'm sure there are other important groups, but are the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association, and they establish in Edgehill, also other places, but they establish these William Penn schools, and I'm not sure entirely how many there were. I used to be a little bit more confident about that. We know that the one that endures is in the Edgehill area, that finally opens in 1866. I think there were evidently some previous ones, and these are Quaker groups. I mean, maybe not exclusively, but that would be the faith, and that's some of the beginning of education for free African Americans in Nashville and in Tennessee.
And you found in doing research, I think for this, which obviously is ongoing for you, you came across someone who came through these schools. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean there's some evidence about kind of how these were operating at the time, but there's also this retrospective. The picture you have up is of Gabriel Nelson Grissom. He was born in Smyrna don't know the exact date, but it would have been probably the 1850s. And he attended the William Penn School in 1866. And I think that is probably the one that was in Edgehill. He goes on to Brown University and he also went to Roger Williams in Nashville. Gets I think a bachelor's degree from Brown, master's degree from Roger Williams in German, which is for me, that's exciting because that's kind of my area. German history is my field. And there is an 1897 address that he gives on the importance of African American scholarship that's still in print today, in which he quotes people that German studies people are familiar with, Goethe and Schiller, and really a little bit even before I'm aware of Du Bois doing this, talks about the importance of academic engagement for African Americans. And so yes, he's a graduate, I believe, of the Penn School in Edgehill, and he goes on to be the founding principal of Lincoln High School in Kansas City, and that picture is from a Lincoln High School yearbook from 1915.
Wow, I mean, that's one probably of many amazing stories that have come out of Edgehill and some of the other neighborhoods around here immediately following the Civil War. I think it's
and those kind of schools. I think I heard Mary Frances Berry say this recently in a video. Just when you think about kind of what resources they had and then what they produced, not only in Edgehill or in Nashville, but across the South, it's really, really remarkable.
Right, and I think to give us some perspective, we go back to that time period, Reconstruction era, immediately following the Civil War. We have a story that's connected to the property that you own now that shows some of the difficulties I think that these people encountered transitioning from enslavement to freedom and then getting an education and trying to make a living. Can you tell us the story of Sophia Kahn?
Yes. So Sophia Kahn was a 24-year-old African-American woman living near the farm of Samuel Ament. And you had mentioned a connection to me and to other people who live in Edgehill. A lot of Edgehill is the former property of Samuel Ament. He was a businessman and a religious leader to some extent in Nashville, and he shot and killed Sophia Kahn for trespassing on his land, and it's documented because this was in the summer of 1866, because the Freedmen's Bureau presses for him to be indicted, and it's documented that there was a lot of effort put into getting him indicted, but it's I think one of those in some ways typical Reconstruction stories, in that a few years later the charges against him are dismissed, and he's never brought to trial. And in fact, 13th Avenue in Edgehill was, for a time, it was named after him. And as I said, the many deeds of people in Edgehill, or the legal description of their property, has his name on it. Sophia Kahn, I discovered recently, is interred at the Nashville City Cemetery, and I don't know how challenging it is to locate the place of her burial, but I would like to do that.
Yeah, because I think I do remember the case just gets dismissed at some point, right? The case against it just sort of drops away.
And even the coverage of it in the local papers is very different, even in terms of the time of day the incident occurred or the killing occurred. That's covered differently in the local news than in the Freedmen's Bureau reports, and it does obviously is evocative and recalls later history too, in the way that some of those killings are recounted and then of course not prosecuted.
Yeah, and another thing that struck me around that time period is that apparently some men in the area formed their own police force and court system. I think we have an account of something perhaps derogatorily referred to as the Rocktown Court, which was another name of another area there that the city officials break up. And
yeah, I don't think we've really, maybe we have, I don't think we've really mentioned the names.
Right, we should.
New Bethel and Rocktown. And those are somewhat distinct areas, but those are, communities in the Edgehill area that form directly from the contraband camp after the Civil War, and Rocktown is a name that goes on into the 20th century.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we have good descriptions of that area is something another thing that had a major impact on the neighborhood, and that was the 1873 cholera epidemic. By then, we have people describing the neighborhood and giving us more information. What can you tell us about that? Do we know what the neighborhood looked like? Why did it hit this community so hard? What do we know about that?
Well, it did. It definitely did impact the Edgehill area or the New Bethel area and the Rocktown area very severely, and there's lots of documentation about that. William K. Bowling, the medical doctor, does an extensive study of the spread of cholera at this time, and you have there, his map. Bowling was mistaken, maybe even in a very serious and fundamental way about how cholera was actually spreading. You can probably explain that better than I can, but my understanding is that he thought that he adhered to this miasmic theory, that it was somehow had to do with the air. Rather than having to do with water quality and water transmission. But as a result of that study, he does go into a lot of detail about the nature of New Bethel and even its history. And he says that the Pennsylvania Freedmen or the Quakers were in Edgehill even earlier. So he has an 1862 date. I've never been able to find that corroborated, but it's a great source for the history of Edgehill. David Curry initially brought that to my attention. It's published in the Nashville Journal of Medicine and Surgery. I think it's all wrong about cholera, but maybe you can correct what I just said and expand on it.
No, that's great. In fact, I'd refer watchers, if they're interested, to our second video, which was about the waterworks and sewer systems, because it talks about the epidemic in a little more detail. But it also mentions that one of the ways that the cholera problem was addressed, since they knew it had something to do with water, so at least some people thought so, was to start advocating for better water systems, more reliable and also cleaner. We have this water supply report from a Professor Landreth, who's at Vanderbilt University. And one of the things he recommended was building a reservoir on Curry's Hill, which is the hill that's right in the middle of the neighborhood today. But it doesn't end up there. So do we know anything about why it ends up where it is?
Yes, that's a great story, and probably yet to be fully kind of recounted. But Professor Landreth was one of three well-known local engineers who wanted to place the reservoir on Curry's Hill, Meridian Hill, Rose Park, and then there was a city engineer originally from Manchester who came in and made the recommendation for Kirkpatrick's Hill.
Manchester, Tennessee, or England?
No, Manchester, England.
England,
yes.
okay.
I should thank you for correcting that. I was talking to students once about Columbia, and somebody said they think you're talking about Columbia.
The country.
But yes, he was originally from Manchester, and he made this recommendation that the Public Works Department affirmed, And then it became a big debate in the city council. And one of the things that I think is a factor in this is that a city council member, Quintard Jones, was the grandson of Robert Curry, and his father, William Palmer Jones, owned Curry's Hill.
Oh.
So there was conflict of interest, comes into it. But there are also, kind of amusing discussions of like, if it's going to cost a lot more to, pump the water up about another 30 to 35 feet. And this is one of those cases where the council passes the recommendation or the condemnation of Kirkpatrick Hill. The mayor sends it back. And so they actually have to kind of override, I mean, not a literal veto, but the process is that they have to vote again. So it's pretty well documented that it was controversial right to the end.
And so it's still in the neighborhood. It's just on the hill south of there, where it does finally get built. Who do you know who built the reservoir? It's obviously a huge masonry project.
So there's a newspaper source that says, I think it's the Daily American from this period, that says that there are 550 workers and that 500 of them are African American. So again, this reminds me a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier with the Franklin Turnpike and with the creation of the antebellum estates, certainly with the building of Fort Negley and Fort Morton. The reservoir is a facility constructed by African Americans and probably local.
Yeah. So the reservoir gets built, and as I said, if viewers are interested, watch the second video where you can learn about what happened to it, which was that at some point it eventually collapses and has to be rebuilt. But it does come to kind of dominate the neighborhood. What happens to this is Kirkpatrick's Hill. That's where the reservoir is now. What happens to Curry's Hill during this time?
That is one of these pieces of Edgehill history where I think that you have maybe done as much or more research as I have. But there is a plan to develop Curry's Hill or Meridian Hill as a planned residential development. And the name Meridian Hill becomes prominent again during this period in the 1890s. I think there are some lots sold, but in the end, Meridian Hill becomes the city's rock quarry, beginning around 1915.
And so that development never happens. And it seems like it would have been a great development if we see some things that are going around there today, which we'll get into later. It has a fantastic view of the city. So my impression was looking at the layout of the land, layout of the neighborhood, that the plan was to turn it into a high-end neighborhood, but obviously that never comes about. I want to move now on out of the 1900s into the teens. There's a few things that happened. You mentioned the quarry. Before we get to that, let's talk about an event that happens there in the 20s, but is preceded by events in the teens, and that is namely the rise of a second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. What can you tell us about what contributed to that and what the result was?
Well, the Ku Klux Klan is revived in the around, I guess, the 19-teens, 1920s. It's different than the original Ku Klux Klan in that it's a national organization that is, directed against, immigrants and confessional religious minorities, as well as against African Americans. The Birth of a Nation film is very significant in that. This is a 1915 silent film that is sometimes regarded as the first feature length or full length. It was a 3-hour film in the United States. Very racist film portraying Reconstruction as the triumph of the Ku Klux Klan and celebrating the Ku Klux Klan, and that contributed to along with many other things to this kind of revival of the Klan. And I see that you have a local protest against it in the newspaper, which I to be honest have not read, but I would like to read that. The place where it's significant for Edgehill is that Curry's Hill, Meridian Hill, Fort Morton is selected as the site for the initial rally, kind of announcing the return of the Ku Klux Klan. And I think there were close to 1,000 people at this, on Meridian Hill. It's significant, obviously, because it was a U.S. sports site, and then there was a headquarters opened near Fort Houston on the roundabout. So that was perhaps also not a coincidence.
Yeah, and I noticed when we found those articles and looking at that particular cross was not burned; it was actually electrified. There are light bulbs, running up it in the shape of a cross. So I imagine it was visible being on that hill through most of the city. But as we've talked about, the fact that it was in a predominantly black neighborhood, I think, was intentional. Also, that it was in a former Union Fort site was likely part of the emphasis too. Now, moving out of the 20s and into the 30s, something happens. I mean, you have this overt white supremacy that is out there in your face, although disguised. And that particular iteration of the Ku Klux Klan ends up getting millions of members worldwide, to the point where there's a march in Washington, D.C., that there are pictures of that is truly astonishing to see. But I think that's indicative of what I'm sure it was frightening and scary to see. But behind the scenes, I think we know now that there were other things going on, in particular how land was controlled, and particularly through loans. And here we see Edgehill in the 30s. What can you tell us about redlining and how and what impact did it have on the city?
Well, these are national color-coded maps by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So they have them for all throughout the country. I think the term redlining may be something that was retroactively applied to these. I mean, that term may, I think, be a little bit later. Not 100% sure on that. But what you see here is a redlining map of the Edgehill area and nearby areas. So there's and interestingly, there's several colors. I heard somebody say recently that we should also talk about green lining because of the way that it diverted investment toward affluent white areas. And interestingly, you don't see any green on this particular map in anywhere close to downtown. But it basically goes from, I believe, I think it's green to blue to yellow to red. And you can see here, I mean, Wedgwood does not exist at this point, but you can see that line that currently defines the southern boundary of Edgehill does define the border on this map between red and yellow. And it was a way of disinvesting or diverting investment away from neighborhoods that weren't white, and that was in fact a factor, right? So I mean, it's not just an incidental effect. It's also it's built into the formula.
Yeah, and a book I can highly recommend is called The Color of Law, that does an excellent job of explaining how this worked all across the country. And it took different shapes and different forms, from restrictive covenants to other ways of controlling who lived where. And in this case, with the lending, it seemed to be that African Americans couldn't get loans for houses that weren't reasonable, that didn't lead easily or eventually even to home ownership. And I think that was a significant factor, which again surprised me, as I mentioned at the beginning, that it's coming from the government. This is not guys in white hoods going around doing that. This is what the government is how the government is influencing the market and ultimately people's lives. Another example of that, I think, that is worth mentioning. You mentioned the quarry earlier. I find it interesting. 1915, they're purchasing land in a few locations around the city, not just Meridian Hill in that area, but it has seems to have a big impact on the neighborhood as well.
I do think it's significant that I mean, I think anyone could just reflect on whether you would want a rock quarry in your neighborhood, and that is something I've thought about a lot in terms of the effect that had.
Yeah, and here in this photo, we can see the gouge. Interestingly, that's the property earlier that was going to be called Meridian Hill and be a development. It is by 1940 is a large hole in the ground. And I think we found out that there was some blasting eventually got stopped there. It was damaging houses, and eventually some lawsuits by residents got at least that part stopped. Now in this photo, we can see in the upper middle, we see a small park, and to the right, you see a large building. That is Carter Lawrence School, which is, there's a different building, but one there located today. Joel, I know this story, but I look forward to you telling it. What is the connection of that school to the earlier schools in the neighborhood?
Well, Carter Lawrence goes all the way back. So the William Penn School that we were discussing earlier, that started in December 1866 with some maybe even schools antedating that. That becomes the William Penn School, becomes the Lawrence School. It moves, but and then the Lawrence School merges in 1940 with the Carter School, which had also had a previous name, the Granny White School, and so that's Carter Lawrence, which of course still exists on the corner of 12th and Edgehill today.
And the school that's standing there today can be traced back to just after the Civil War. Then that there's a lineage that goes all the way back to that time period.
That's right. I find that really, really amazing that we have, and some churches in Edgehill too. I mean, go back to pretty much the same period. But yeah, Carter Lawrence, you can really date it back to 1866, which is really I find really remarkable.
Let's move on now to we start getting in by the 50s. We're getting into public housing being introduced, which obviously eventually leads to urban renewal. But we have an early development by the city in the neighborhood that ends up being called Edgehill Homes. What do we know about this development, and what people in the neighborhood may have thought about it?
Well, this was the beginning of well, not the absolute beginning, but it was an earlier period of federal housing policy. It's the print's pretty small on the slide, but I did want to point out that this is a picture of the area that becomes Edgehill Homes between 12th and 14th and between Edgehill and Horton. Those homes are still there today. The public housing is. This illustrates something, and I'm not an expert on urban renewal, but I do want to say, just for my own behalf, that I'm very suspicious of Nashville Housing Authority and any housing authorities' photographs connected to urban renewal, because of course they're taking pictures of things that they are, intending to show need to be rehabilitated or in most cases torn down. And so that picture, I think, probably doesn't really reflect that the that neighborhood. I mean, you're looking at a backyard and a kind of outhouse. There was this earlier period of urban renewal. It's certainly been characterized as being less controversial, but there is a letter from an Edgehill resident to the Tennessean, Maurice Parham, who lived exactly on the northwest corner of what becomes Edgehill Homes, right there at 14th Avenue. And as you can see in this letter, he was a tailor who worked downtown. He was a graduate of the Hampton Institute. And he later, because of this development, he had to move on to 15th Avenue. But you can see here, he says that the neighborhood is being mischaracterized, that 95% of the residents own and occupy their homes, and that their options for finding other housing are limited by violence and by just economic factors. So there was some opposition in the neighborhood even to this early period of public housing development, and that corner will always remind me of Maurice Parham.
Right, and as we can see in the next picture there, we see what the housing development was, how it was drawn. There's a baseball field in the middle of it there. I don't know if that ever actually happened, but a lot of people did live there, and so we can see in the next slide the residents were treated by the county health department for various things. And did you say you know someone
when I saw this picture, I felt like if anybody from the McCord family is ever watching this video, so Linus McCord is the person who built the house where I live, and I believe this is his son, Deerwood McCord, and a grandson of Linus McCord. The Reverend Donald McCord is still living in the neighborhood down the street, and I know him. So that's.
And he was the man standing in the middle of the picture.
That's correct.
Yeah. So I feel like this ushers in a way, even though it wasn't called urban renewal, that's the way these sort of projects are marketed by city officials and federal officials later. But it seems to start with the park here. We had the small park that was near the school, but another park comes into play in the early 60s. What is this park?
Well, this is Rose Park, and this is the 1960s. It says on the slide it's a plan for Rose Park. This was the result of a lot of activism in favor of improving parks for African Americans in Nashville. This is still, even though it wasn't supposed to be, as you can see, it's still very much the segregation era, and there was definitely a need for the park. It does come into existence through partly through the rock quarry being used for something else, but also from moving part of Edgehill. So in that regard, it is kind of the beginning of this kind of more 1960s urban renewal.
And when that starts, I know we've been able to find in the archives brochures and maps and various things that were put out to promote the urban renewal plan for Edgehill. Here we see again the pictures of the quote unquote blight, and some of the homes definitely are, you can tell, are for poorer residents of the neighborhood. But there's also a wide range of housing there. The plan was complex. I mean, here we have a man whose house was refurbished during urban renewal, so there aspects of it seem like could have had a positive effect generally on some of the residents, but what do we know the urban renewal had a bigger impact than just some new posts for your porch. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it involves a lot of displacement, and I guess even with reference to, I don't know if this would be officially called urban renewal, but you see here the South Street Community Center, that had to be relocated to Edgehill Avenue. Interestingly, it kept being called the South Street Community Center until 1990. I think that was in 1971. But yeah, I think in the 1960s there was increasingly a recognition that that urban renewal was becoming abusive to a lot of people in the neighborhood, and there was organization to try to mitigate that. The Organized Neighbors of Edgehill, which still exists today, I believe that organization was formed in 1967 in the context of trying to address some of the abuses and negative effects of urban renewal. I think this is and probably prior to the formation of O&E, but that was obviously a community organization or people speaking out about urban renewal. This picture from 1968, that again is something that you found, but that accompanied a Frank Ritter Tennessean article, and you can see this was a family that was removed from their house, and this was a house that had already been acquired on 9th Avenue by the Metro Housing Authority. They had the house for I think 7 months by this point, had not maintained it, and the Tennessean actually sent in reporters to investigate it, and it was terrible. But because the rent hadn't been paid, they evicted the family of I think 2 parents and the four children. 2 of them are pictured there from their home. So,
yes, the city evicted them because the city owned it at this point.
Right.
Through urban renewal. Okay, got you. Again, amazing, as I mentioned in the opening, amazing the impact that the urban renewal had. This next photo, I think, is a good. That shows the human side of it. This shows the physical side of it, where you can see the park on the left, and then down the hill, going to the right towards that double road, which is today's South Street. There's nothing there but trees. Hardly all the houses are gone. As we'll learn in a few minutes, talking to Mr. Miller, there were businesses up and down South Street. Just amazing to me the impact that program had on the area. Now, in this picture, there's no interstate yet, but if we look at this one, we see the interstates coming in and further dividing up the neighborhood, and in some cases making access to it more difficult. Again, I've just been amazed by it, and I think before we go any further, I'd like to bring in Mr. Miller to talk about his experiences during this time period. Mr. Miller, thanks for your patience in waiting for us to bring you on. Tell us, when did you were, I know you said told me you were born at Meharry, and your parents, where were your parents living at that time in Edgehill?
On Villa Place. I came to Villa Place when I was born.
And you're still on Villa Place today, right?
Villa Place, 2 doors down from
So,
where I lived as a child.
So tell us a little bit about your family's experience when they first moved into the neighborhood, and what it was like for you growing up there.
Okay, my family, Hicks, they had a business on South Street, probably in 29, a grocery store. Also, as you see in this picture, dairy dip. That's my mother's second from the right, my brother in the middle. And we had been on they had been on South Street since the 20s. Came to Villa Place in 43, I believe. And we were able to buy a house on Villa Place. They had worked hard. My uncle who raised us had worked in the rock quarry for 10 years and said he couldn't do it anymore and decided to go into business. And that's what moved us from the rock quarry, from family from South Street, still had the business, to Villa Place. And we were there been there ever since, over 70 years. This is a picture of my mother, who after that, ran the service station after my father died. And she ran it till about 1960 and sold it, the business, and went to work at the grocery store.
And
So
she owned, or the family owned that property there at 12th and South Street?
Dr. Meadows, I believe, owned the black physician owns the property, but we did own the property at 1104 South Street and several others adjacent to 1104 coming up toward the station.
And this was your great uncle,
My great uncle.
Great Uncle Hicks, and he also founded a church there. That's correct.
Founded the church on 813 11th Avenue South, which is on where the Beeman cars sit. This church was middle ways down from off South Street, block and a half off South Street. And that was started in June of 61. And later been bought out by Urban Renewal.
And so that was dislocated. Did it end or was it moved?
No, it moved to 70. We moved to 1515 Sweetbriar Avenue and built a church there, which is still in operation now.
It's still in operation. Now, where did you go to school? Was it in the neighborhood?
I attended Carter Lawrence for 6 years. This is a picture of me at Carter Lawrence. We were, I guess, graduation day, and I'm on the second row, 1, 2, 3, 4, and my neighbor across the street is on the second row, and Lil Davis, we were all friends, and we had a big school. You can see it's a big class. They all had on black and white, and the young ladies sat on one side, and the boys sat on the other side, and it was a proud day. We can remember it like it was yesterday.
And you went from there. Now we had a photo earlier.
Traveled to Rose Park, 66, and was in the band, played cymbals, and we were there from 66. That's at one time was the baseball diamond with bleachers, and then later on to where all the kids had to go to high school was Cameron. So I graduated from Cameron. In that year, we won the state championship.
Oh, really? Now, did you say you traveled somewhere with Cameron at that?
We would go to the games with Cameron, and we went to the game, and we were fortunate. We went to the game, championship game that was at the University of Tennessee, and we were there. So we had been disqualified from participating in any high school sports in my junior year, and then came back in the senior year, and we under Ronald Lawson won the championship. Lawson was president of Fisk University's son and an NBA player that came back to Nashville, but we won the championship game.
So so being that you had family who owned, I think Joe found an obituary for Mr. Hicks that called him the owner and operator of South Street. I mean, they had a lot of businesses there, and you were involved with some of those businesses early on. I think some of it even in real estate. Can you talk a little bit about how early you got into that and what it was like to growing up there?
I was very young. I would deliver groceries on my bicycle once I learned how to ride the bicycle. That's the story. But I was a very young person going around collecting. He had rooms upstairs, and I would, in those days, you go by and knock on the door and collect your rent money most of the time. So I grew up doing that as a 9, 10-year-old. I'd come from Carter Lawrence and come to the store and help my mother in the grocery stores on evenings. So I grew up with that. And they were acquiring houses out in Edgehill and 11th Avenue, all up around the grocery store. There was a restaurant there, barber shop, several different several different businesses that they owned and operated, as well as the ice cream parlor.
So, and the main one was the Hicks grocery store, right? Now I know you guys were affected, and the family was affected by urban renewal. If we show this next picture of Hicks Grocery, here we can see a map that the city published in marketing urban renewal, and the area marked in the circle is where you guys had businesses, and I think the Hicks Tabernacle Church was in that location. The store was in that location. All of that was destroyed. Is that correct?
That's correct. They were all brick buildings, and Urban Renewal. They were, fairly new compared to the rest because he, moved, built and things. As you can see, they had a telephone, and that was something a lot of people didn't have at that time. And I can remember the payphone, and
Oh yeah, I could see the little Bell South sign on
South.
Yeah, on there. So so we know now, connecting this to today in a little ways, that property in 10 or so years later was bought by private companies. And you mentioned Beeman earlier, that I think they still own. What this property obviously was in your family. It was taken over by the government. Did the family think about fighting, or was eminent domain involved? What?
Eminent domain was the lay of the land there. Families, that couldn't stand up to the government when they said it was for eminent domain. So it was trying times. Some people, tried to say something, but they came through and rolled it over, and it was take your money and go.
And do you know what's happening with that property today? Either you or Joel know what's going on with that property today?
They're in process of having it rezoned. It's before it just passed the Metro Planning Commission and moving on to the council for its, I think they've already had the first reading and getting ready to have public hearings sometime soon, next few weeks.
And so it'll be rezoned as
Rezoned by the Marquette Company of Chicago is multi-million-dollar housing. I think maybe 5 or 6 structures, as high as 9 stories high. A couple of the buildings, a promise of a grocery store on the corner of Hawkins and 12th Avenue. And at one time they had proposed a hotel to give the community jobs, but for some reason that's been withdrawn.
And you had mentioned when we spoke earlier that even the layout of the roads in the neighborhood were changed. When that was happening, what did you and your neighbors think of what was going on at the time?
Well, remember a lot of, I guess the day you would call it traffic calming, but when we looked at it, we thought they were just kind of keeping people out of the neighborhood. They would cut off the street, different streets. I can remember when Hawkins ran all the way down to Music Row on 16th, and they cut that off. And we saw a street where I live on the corner at Grand and Villa. They blocked it off, so people couldn't really come into the neighborhood by mistake. That's the way we felt at that time.
And you felt like that was an intentional isolation?
We kind of looked at it that way because it stopped us from coming in and out. There's a grocery store at 16th and 16th and Grand, hardware store, and you had to go all the way around if you were driving to come through there. You couldn't park on Grand, so that was a lot. I thought about why it was being cut off. You couldn't come down Grand on South Street. I mean, from 12th Avenue. That was a problem. All those streets were cut off, and you sometimes wonder why was it like that. But they used to be through streets.
Well, we had another thing you mentioned in the conversation is a doctor's office that was.
Doctor's offices, several doctors that lived and had their own offices on 12th Avenue. One of my friends that I remember before he died, Frank McClinton, lived at the corner of South Street. Lived at the corner of Villa in Edgehill, but had an office right next to Carter Lawrence School. So many students gave shots at South Street Center so you could go to camp. You had Dr. Meadows. There were so many business leaders that were in the neighborhood, school teachers, principals. On our street, there were two principals, one at Johnson and one at Fort Greene in the same block. And so, we thought we had a pretty good neighborhood. But changes of Urban Renewal had pushed us. When they bought most of the people out, most moved south on the other side of what's now Wedgwood. Because I remember growing up as a child, we did not go in, having no reason to go beyond Akron. And I remember my first time going out beyond Akron, I thought it sure was a long way. And that was then when the family was bought out, we ended up buying property in what's now called 12 South.
And some of this, I guess we can say it's fair to say it's had a legacy. How this is carried on till today. We can't. I don't even know enough to go into what all that may be, but we do know that with E.S. Rose Park, after it was built, the city's now leasing it to Belmont University. Knowing Joel, I know this has been controversial. Joel, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I was gonna, with his permission, ask Ronnie if he would if he would take that question. But I will say there was the basics of it are that Belmont sought to lease the park in 2006 and 2007. There was a lot of opposition. There was litigation in the state courts, but they redesigned the park in 2010, and they currently have a 40-year lease to use the park for their outdoor athletics programs. And if Ronnie doesn't mind saying more about that, but yeah, that's the basics of it.
Yeah, Mr. Miller. Have you felt like? I understand there's supposed to be community involvement and the community's able to use it. Have you seen that that's the case, or what is the neighborhood's reaction to it today?
It offers a place to go walk, but it's not you think if you were a community that you would have, the city would have tried to develop something for the community. We're seeing this in North Nashville now. It looks like you have a probably $8 million park, but it's not for the, it wasn't built for the community. And so a good example, Belmont had, when on prime time days, the parking lot is so full, if you're having something at the community center, there's nowhere to park because of the ball game that goes on. It's just an extension of Belmont University on Metro's taxpayers' land.
Yeah, that's I feel like I know that to me it's pretty obviously that is in principle some extension of urban renewal thinking, because as Joe mentioned earlier, they're not building a rock quarry and in other neighborhoods. There were some, but this one in particular, and they're also not building private university ballparks in other people's public parks. So it does, to me, seem very suspicious that is how it's played out. But I do want to emphasize here that there's a lot of positive history, a lot of a positive legacy that's come from the neighborhood, and I'd like to talk about that now. Both Mr. Miller and Joel, can you tell us, say for instance, about the McKissicks and their connection to the neighborhood?
Okay, Joel.
Okay, well, Moses McKissick III and Calvin McKissick did form the first Black architectural firm in the United States. There are a lot of things. There are some things in Nashville that are rightly named for them, and including a school and a park. Interestingly, there is not a historical marker in Edgehill, but their houses are in Edgehill. Their houses are on Edgehill. So that's I think that's a project for the future. But that's a really important, and a colleague of mine from the McKissick family, Gloria McKissick, retired from Hume Fogg and TSU. She lives in Edgehill and is a wonderful person.
So you're saying their actual houses are still there and standing?
Yes.
Oh,
yep.
I didn't know that.
On the corner of Edgehill and 15th.
Oh,
yes, houses are there.
I didn't know that was theirs. And what about now? At the moment, Cheekwood has an exhibit, I think, that closes soon, of the artwork of William Edmondson. What do we know about him in relation to the neighborhood?
Well, William Edmondson lived on 14th, and had his kind of outdoor studio there. And it is believed that he got his stones from the quarry. There is now both a Metro Nashville historical marker and a Tennessee historical marker at his home site, and there are neighbors who are really advocating to protect the home site. If you don't mind, I wanted to plug a book. It's very hard to find book, but there's a book called The Art of William Edmondson that was published about 20 years ago that has a great essay by Bobby Lovett on William Edmondson and Edgehill. And it was kind of my first real introduction to just how significant the neighborhood is. So it's great on William Edmondson, but it's also great on Edgehill.
And I guess finally we're talking about DeFord Bailey. I mean, Nashville's known for country music. Is Music City, USA? There's a connection to the neighborhood there too. Tell us about that.
Well, DeFord Bailey is, along with William Edmondson, he is the other historic neighborhood resident who has a historical marker there at 12th and Edgehill. He had a business on 12th Avenue, and Ronnie introduced me to somebody who knew him personally and said that he was, in addition to being a great musician, that he was just about the best dressed person you ever saw. And I think that picture, may reflect that. I don't have his book handy, but there is actually a book about DeFord Bailey, as well as a great, PBS documentary. So yeah, he's another figure, and I would say that there are a lot more. I'm just names. I know we have to not delay too long, but Kwame Lillard was from Edgehill. Callie House, who Mary Frances Berry has written a book about, who was an early advocate for reparations. She lived in Edgehill. Murray Blakemore, one of the first post-Reconstruction African-American state legislators, is Edgehill. I mean, Ronnie can probably name a lot more. I learned recently from a neighbor, King Hollins, that Jim Lawson, when he was at Vanderbilt and organizing the sit-ins, was in Edgehill. So there's a lot of history to discover and to honor.
Now, I understand you both were involved in this next project we want to discuss and wrap this up. If you drive down 12th or a few of the streets today, you will see signs that say Edgehill, but feature a polar bear. Joel or Mr. Miller, what can you guys tell me about why that is the case?
Polar bears became famous in Edgehill. It dates back to the 40s when the Polar Ice Cream Company decided that they no longer wanted the polar bears and would put up for sale. And a local undertaker, Zimmer Hill, purchased them and put them in front of the funeral home. And they were known as the pallbearers. And later on, they moved to Edgehill at his home there. And they were sold with the house. And the new tenants, new owners kept them. And so we received a grant and purchased the bears in 2002. We got with the Civic Design Center, and we had a national competition to design a place for the bears. And company was awarded, the person was awarded, and the bears was the site was developed, and it was placed at 12th and Edgehill on MDHA property. And so they've been there ever since. But the Bears and they called it the Bear Plaza. And that was a design for, through Civic Design Award program.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with me. Again, Dr. Joel Dark and Mr. Ronnie Miller, I'm very grateful for your taking the time to talk with us and help us learn about this history, because again, like as I said in the beginning, it's fascinating. I think it's too little known about it, as far as popular culture goes and popular history. It needs to be more well known than it is. There's really just no excuse for it. So anyway, I guess we'll end it here. Thank you both again for talking with us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our episode 3 of the Nashville Retrospect Conversations. Thank you again for watching. We went a little longer than usual on this one, but it's you can tell there's so much we left out. That this is actually short compared to how long it could have been. But I do want to remind you that if you want to know more about learn more about Nashville history, be sure to visit NashvilleRetrospect.com. Again, there's a free podcast. There's back issues of the Nashville Retrospect newspaper to order. There's the Nashville History Map, and be sure to sign up for our free email newsletter called the Nashville Retrospect Dispatch. Thank you again, and we'll be talking to you soon about the next episode.